Now, this afternoon, the Energy Crisis Committee will give details on President Cyril Ramaphosa's power plan. Ramaphosa announced an energy action plan to slash red tape in a bid to end the country's power crisis. But there are concerns as to how Eskom will execute its developmental state mandate. In 2020, for instance, when the COVID-19 state of disaster was declared, tenders went to big business, while smaller ones were skipped over. Let's speak to economist Xhanti Payi to explain the developmental responsibility that Eskom has and what government can do to ensure the execution of the president's plan. Xhanti, thank you very much for your time on all angles. You know, having this conversation with you reminds me of a conversation that my colleague Dan Moyane had with the former president Thabo Mbeki, who said the current president's explanation of the crisis is not actually a plan. He says it's a vision for now. What do you think? I think you've muted yourself, Xhanti, if you just unmute very quickly.
Thank you. I think that the important thing here really is important, of course, that we have to have a vision. I think that's a very, very important thing. But within that vision, of course, you have to sort of, as I always say in management and, and in consulting, that you take that down into plans or into a strategy. And I think that's where we are lacking. Certainly, there's no doubt we have to have a long-term vision about our energy program. So we know, how do we see energy, and how do we see that energy actually, supporting the economy in various ways. And I think that is an important thing. Now, what we also need to understand, of course, is that as the president speaks so eloquently in his address, that we actually, of course, have a crisis and that we need to plan accordingly, both in short term and long term. But part of that vision, of course, is not just to provide energy, but to make sure that actually that energy is provided to people in a manner that is equitable, and that also, undertakes to deal with other areas of our society, including obviously creation of jobs, making sure that we transform, include people, because we can't talk about growth if we're not talking about the inclusion of people. And I think this is the part, of course, that's very, very important in a dynamic society, is that we don't just look at achieving one thing, but we look at actually how we can spread the gains. And energy is an important sector in terms of how we actually bring in or include people. And I think that's something that we need a plan about, so that actually we don't reverse the gains that we've made because we are working so urgently. And I think this is important, of course, because I think some people have also mentioned that this idea of living behind the regulations or laws because we are in a crisis can take us back.
All right. So now, can we afford this? I mean, Eskom already speaking to the media saying that they might need to actually apply for more tariff hikes after last month's tariff hikes. They're saying for them to be able to afford some of this planned maintenance, going faster, etc., it means more hikes for the consumer.
Look, one of the things that I think are important, and one of the things that have been talked about, remember, in terms of provision of energy and actually almost, privatizing energy. One of the things that have always been talked about is how you want a competitive environment. And one of the things, of course, that are important about energy is that you want, as little transmission as possible, because that's also costly. So one way to make it competitive, which would actually also help in terms of prices, is deregulating and actually bringing it closer to people. I think, as I was saying earlier, one of the places that has been missing there is to involve communities. So the president talks about generating and everybody being able to generate. That doesn't happen automatically. You want, for example, to bring in stockfellers who may be able to invest in energy. Stockfellers could invest in energy generation in people's communities, closer to people. And that, of course, helps in terms of sharing energy, generating, so that you don't have these long transmission lines and all of that. So I think an important part of that is going to be the competitiveness part is important, because then it can help us with prices. If it helps us with prices, then it also includes people. So I think that the dynamic is so interesting, because also we know that as we produce energy in terms of renewable energy, we are going to be taking out some of the long-term coal energy, which has been paying people more. So all of this is important to think about as a plan. So the vision clearly is there, as we say. But what we need is to make sure that we, as we displace people from work in one area, we include people for work in the other area. We remain competitive so that people can afford it. And when people can afford it, it's usually when people can actually bring in, I mean, one of the best ways to bring down prices is to bring in the services closer to people. It is to bring the product closer to people in terms of its production. And then, of course, you don't have those transport costs. So all of these things are important. And I think as we look ahead, we really have to focus on how we may include the smaller men, the smaller player into the grid so that they too can participate and we can actually make it more accessible and equitable. I think that's going to be very, very important. And one of the things that could help us in terms of both the price in question and also the accessibility and the inclusion question.
Yeah. Speaking about inclusion, I mean, for me, this is yet another committee, right, that has to deal with the same problem. We've had, for instance, during the State of the Nation address, he announced that he would have somebody in the presidency looking at, reducing red tape and bureaucracy. Then we also have the former governor of the Reserve Bank, Daniel Mineli, who is, the head of another task team looking at climate change and energy in South Africa. And now this particular ministerial crisis task, energy crisis task team that is expected to give us more details this afternoon. Task team after task team, this cannot be another talk shop. I think, it's very important for the president and the government to realize it cannot be another talk shop. But talk to me about how important it is that they actually come up with solutions today as to how we're going to afford it, inclusion, and all the things that you've mentioned.
Look, I think you raise an important question about task teams, because one it is clear is when you form any task team or you form any grouping of people, you have to answer the question, what are we trying to solve here? I think one of the things that hasn't been clear, and I listened to the president very closely, what is the task team going to do that has not been achieved by other formations or groupings or of course, we've had war rooms, we have had SOE groupings, all of these people that are brought together, all of these formations that are brought together. What does this one aim to achieve? What does it aim to resolve that others have not been able to do? And I think this is the main problem. I suspect it is one area, obviously, where, it is much more political than it is solving any problem. But it's not clear to me why you actually needed one like this one, because we've had all of these standing committees. Of course, we've got Parliament that has been asking ESCOM questions. We've got a board of ESCOM that is supposed to do this work. You've got, executive teams at ESCOM. You've got all sorts of formations. And I think it's not clear why the president feels that this one is particularly important. He said something that I thought was also interesting when he said they will report to him, directly to him. And I thought, well, where do ministers actually report? They tend to report to the president anyway. Yeah. So I thought that is interesting, but it's not clear to me at all. So perhaps more light has to be shed, and maybe they will say something about that when they speak about what their particular role is in terms of.
All right, thank you so much, Xhanti, for speaking to us here on All Angles. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens at around 3:30. That ministerial task team into our energy crisis holding a media briefing this afternoon around 3:30. My colleague Govan Whittles will be covering that for us. And, of course, we'll take you there live here on eNCA.